In 1954, the world was introduced to a monster that would terrify millions, level entire cities, and battle dozens of other giant creatures for over 60 years. Godzilla emerged from the sea and quickly became a cinematic icon, going on to star in over 30 feature films, as well as television series, comic books, video games, and more. It would earn a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame and enter the Guinness Book of Records as history's longest-running film franchise. Godzilla is without a doubt the king of the monsters. On this franchise review and retrospective, we will go on a journey film by film from Godzilla's birth in 1954's seminal Gojira to Toho Studios' most recent animated Godzilla adventures and more. We will begin with the Showa era in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s up until the current Reiwa era, which extends to the present day. The Godzilla film franchise is categorized by these eras, named after the emperor who was in power in Japan at the time those films were made. The flavor and tone of the films in these eras also differ in interesting ways, and so we'll explore what evolves tonally era to era and how Godzilla as a character grows and changes from film to film. Whether you've been a fan your whole life or are completely new to the world of kaiju and Godzilla, join my co-host Chris and I as we start from the very beginning in the Showa era. The Showa era of Godzilla ran from 1954's original Gojira until Terror of Mechagodzilla in 1975. This run of 15 films would set the tone for all the movies that followed. They introduced Godzilla as a deadly and terrifying force of nature, evolving into a role of protector and even friend of humanity. They also introduced the world to a number of Godzilla's most famous foes and allies, King Ghidorah, Anguirus, Mechagodzilla, Mothra, and more, who would appear in numerous films throughout the franchise. Mothra and Rodan had already starred in their own movies before sharing the screen with Godzilla. This era is largely defined by a tone of whimsical fun, with huge monster battles and outlandish sci-fi and fantasy subplots. They're fun for the whole family and are some of the most iconic examples of Godzilla and what these films represent to so many. But before the aliens, robots, and undersea cultists entered the scene, there was the horrifying original film that started it all. Silence. Then, thundering footsteps. Finally, a deafening, unmistakable roar, accompanied by stark white lettering over inky black. And thus begins Ishiro Honda's 1954's Godzilla.
Let them fight.
You're a wizard, Harry.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. I'll be back.
Death has come to your little township.
Hey everyone, how's it going? And welcome to the very first episode of Chills and Thrills. My name is Connor Dunham, and I am here with my special guest, Chris, who will be joining me for what is my favorite film franchise in the Godzilla franchise. I was introduced to this at a very young age from my Uncle Bob, probably 5 or 6 years old. I didn't really get into this original Godzilla film until later on. I grew up on the Heisei era and a little bit of the Showa era, such like Godzilla vs. Megalon, Gigan, Invasion of Astro Monster, and I didn't see this original Japanese Godzilla film until the Criterion Collection came to the United States and was released. And I have to say, I truly appreciate this Japanese version, having not seen it and only having seen the 1956 Godzilla King of the Monsters that was edited and released in the United States. But I've always been a huge Godzilla fan, been looking to get a podcast going on film and whatnot, and what better franchise to start with than my favorite one. So Chris, how were you introduced to Godzilla, or what fond memories do you have of it?
Yeah, I would say the VHS days of the early mid '90s when I was basically a toddler little guy. The movie, I can never remember watching King Kong versus Godzilla for the first time. We always had the VHS, and I just always kind of remember knowing that movie or having seen that movie. It was probably a combination of my dad or my older brother that popped that in one day and just had me kind of, mesmerized. And we also had, what was the other Godzillas? We had a handful of Godzillas on VHS. King Kong versus Godzilla was one of them. King of the Monsters was the other, but it was in black and white. So as a kid, I almost never watched it. Uh, Going in order after that, it'd probably be Godzilla versus the Sea Monster. We had that tape. Then we had Gigan, Megalon, and Mecha Godzilla. So that was the first wave. We would rent some of them from our local Blockbuster. Our local Blockbuster didn't have all of them, but it had a few selections: Son of Godzilla, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Godzilla versus the Thing, aka Mothra versus Godzilla, Godzilla's Revenge, aka All Monsters Attack, Terror of Mecha Godzilla. I remember it was a really mind blowing moment for me when I kind of realized that my memories of Mecha Godzilla were actually two different Mecha Godzilla movies. I didn't. It took me I remember like realizing there was two different Mecha Godzilla movies because I remember the one that we had on VHS. There were things about it. I was like, I remember these other things happening. I remember Mechagodzilla having a second head underneath his head. I was like, I remember that, but why isn't it in this movie? And then I found out later it's two different Mechagodzilla movies. Uh, Biollante was the newest movie that our local Blockbuster had for a number of years. And then once you get to the late 90s, your 98s, 99s, the Heisei films of the 90s started to come out on VHS in America. And my dad would collect those for me. For my 10th birthday, my Godzilla VHS collection was completed. So it included everything up to Godzilla 2000 on VHS that I either had or didn't have already. And so that was like the full I had the complete Godzilla VHS collection up to Godzilla 2000 for my 10th birthday in 2002. Uh, so yeah, just always been a lifelong fan. Eventually made the transition to buying them on DVD, Blu-ray. I also didn't see the original 54 version of Godzilla until I would say about 2014, 2015 when it came to the Criterion collection in I think 2011, 2012ish, and I bought the Blu-ray a couple of years after that, kind of in the 2014 MonsterVerse hype, and loved the 54 version, but I'll always have a soft spot for the 56 King of the Monsters just for the nostalgia.
Yeah, growing up on the 56, I seen this 54 Japanese version a little later than you. I honestly don't think I seen it until me and my lady marathoned all the Godzilla films because she had never seen any of them. So me nerding out, I was like, "Oh my God, I gotta show you this," and that was probably 2019.
Mm.
So it was a little while ago, but then ever since then, I mean, I've seen it probably 10 times. So I do enjoy this one, and it's a fun film, and I mean, it's critical to history. I mean, this is probably one of the most historical monster films or kaiju films of all time.
I mean, arguably, not to overinflate it, but in terms of films, I don't know of any other non-based on a book, non-based on a comic, non-based on a literary character or a historical event or something like that, an original film that spawned a 70-year franchise of nearly 40 films. There's not very many movies that have that feather in their cap, and that all, every additional movie that comes out every year is just an extra footnote onto the legacy of this original film that started it all. So I mean, it's an insane legacy that it has.
Yeah, I mean, another film legacy, I mean, for like a monster film would be like King Kong, but that didn't have a movie every 2 years on average or so, but every 30 years, every, 25, 30 years, King Kong is remade. And that's one of the films that inspired, the original Godzilla, along with, what is it? The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms.
Indeed, there are definitely the precursors to Godzilla, things like King Kong. the Lost World from 1925 to an extent, as far as dinosaurs in a modern setting. That's a bit, kind of in line with Godzilla at the core. Beast from 20,000 Fathoms for sure. If you ever watch an old Superman animated short from the 1940s called The Arctic Giant, it is about finding a giant dinosaur, they say, in the Arctic. It thaws out in the city. It comes back alive, rampages in the city, and Superman has to take care of it. And if you look at the Arctic Giant, it's green, and its posture and a lot of details about it are very, very much like Godzilla. If you were to see that cartoon, you might even assume that the cartoon was made after the original Godzilla and they intentionally made the monster look like Godzilla, but it was about 12 or 13 years prior to the original Godzilla. So I mean, there are a few of these sort of these precursors, these ancestors to Godzilla, but Godzilla was definitely a turning point and a game-changing moment.
Yeah, I love the original King Kong, and this I just recently for the first time watched The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and enjoyed it. But even those two, in my own mind and heart, they don't compare to the Godzilla franchise or this 54 original film. That
Exactly.
and
Yeah, it's very much how before Spider-Man, the first Spider-Man with Tobey Maguire, Sam Raimi, 2002. It's sort of like before that, yeah, you had X-Men and you had Blade kind of doing cool superhero movies, but Spider-Man was kind of the boom moment for the new millennium. After Spider-Man is when it blew up. Godzilla is 54 is very much the same way. It's got things that led to it, but it's a big nexus moment.
yeah, a milestone in film history, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not an understatement to say that. It's a little, it's a huge statement to say, but it's not terribly inaccurate.
Yeah, I mean, and anyone who's seen these films and appreciates them, like, or understands what we're saying, I mean, they know that we're not wrong. And anyone who hasn't seen these films, that eventually, from listening to us or other podcasts, end up giving these films a chance, will understand once they see the special effects and the characterization and just everything that goes into it.
Yeah, it's called Get Educated.
Yeah, if you haven't seen Godzilla, get on our level, people.
Yeah, yeah,
There's
yeah.
38 of them now. Come on.
Get on
You're
board.
you're way behind.
90%, 99% of modern movies suck anyway. Do some, I call it cinematic archaeology, and go find some good stuff.
Yeah, because I mean there's I was born in 93 and there is plenty of phenomenal films from the 50s and early 60s. I love the Universal monster movies that even go farther back than that.
Yeah, yeah, the 30s. Yeah, the original Dracula, Frankenstein, Wolfman. Those are so we're so far removed that watching a film from that era, it's almost like watching a film from like another planet or another country. The aesthetics of cinema have changed so much. Every aspect of the technology of movie making has changed so much, but even the way acting is performed and the way dialogue is delivered and the way scripts are structured and the way characters are written, everything about it, it's just a peek into a completely different era of the world that you weren't alive for. And so there are these amazing time capsules, and that's what these Godzilla films are as well. They're not just movies, they're representations of the history and the moments in time that they were made in.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the time, like for the earlier films, the black and white kind of like pushes people away from them. And that's what you have to appreciate about the films, the historical value of them, I guess you could say. And then once they get into color in the 60s and stuff, they get a little cheesier and a little more kid friendly. And so, there's in this 54 film, it hits hard. I mean, it's not, for the weak of heart. It's a sad film. There's a lot of death in it. There's a lot of things going on that's not per se meant for kids.
Hmm.
But I mean, as a kid grows older, they'll understand and appreciate it if they see it at a young age and grow up with it. Then I'd say I did at 20 years old, or 25 years old, seeing this for the first time. I seen the Americanized version, but that one, it was a little more friendly and it didn't hit on all the aspects that the Japanese 54 version did.
Yeah, agreed. It's one where if you're too young and you watch it, it's mostly just going to be boring because kids won't even like little kids won't even pick up on the darker things that are going on, or just kind of all kind of like they just kind of mentally tune out. It's just going to be seen as boring, and the effects are going to be seen as cheesy, and they'll laugh at it and stuff. But if you hit the right kind of moment where you can get over the humps of, oh, it's a black and white movie, oh, it's an old movie, then and you can sit down and watch it for the characters and the story and what's actually on display, it's a really great film.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with you. Let me get into some history for us on the 54 Godzilla. This is a Godzilla is a 1954 Japanese kaiju film directed and co-written by Ishiro Honda with special effects by Eiji Tsuburaya. It was produced and distributed by Toho, and it is the first film in the Godzilla franchise. This film stars Akira Takarada, Momoko Kochi, Akihiko Harada, and Takashi Shimura, with Hiro Nakajima and Katsumi Tezuka as Godzilla. Godzilla entered production after Japanese-Indonesian co-production collapsed. Tsuburaya originally proposed for a giant octopus in this film before the filmmakers decided on a dinosaur-inspired creature. Godzilla pioneered a form of special effects called suitmation, in which a stunt performer wearing a suit interacts with miniature sets or such as buildings, trains, cars. And principal photography for this film ran 51 days, and special effects photography ran a total of 71 days. Godzilla premiered in Nagoya on October 27, 1954, and received a wide release in Japan on November 3rd. The film was met with mixed reviews upon release, but was a box office success, winning the Japanese Movie Association Award for Best Special Effects. And the film at the time earned 183 million yen in distributor rentals, making it the eighth highest grossing Japanese film of that year. And in 1956, a heavily re-edited Americanized version titled Godzilla King of the Monsters was released in the United States. And there are some big differences there. I know the American version runs about 80 minutes, and the Japanese original runs, I believe it's like 96. So there's quite a difference in the films. The Japanese version's a little darker. The Americanized version, I mean, it's a little lighter, a little bit more for kids or for American audiences. Um, there's a few differences that I recognize, such as Godzilla's height. In the Americanized version, they talk of him being 400 feet tall, when in the Japanese version, I believe he's 165 feet tall.
Yeah,
Chris, if you want to go into a little more on that.
yeah, absolutely. So, a lot of people, the 56 King of the Monsters version kind of has a bit of a reputation as like, oh, it's this destroyed, crazy, altered, disrespectful version of the 54. It's like, sure, 54 is the superior cut of the film, but to kind of put it into context, back then there was a bit of a theatrical market for foreign films that were released subtitled. It was not a very large market, but it existed. Art house cinemas, things like that. For a distributor who was looking at Godzilla to recognize its commercial value, to dub it, and to not only dub it into English, but to film new scenes and re-edit the film to tailor it to American audiences, that wasn't a sign of disdain towards the quality of the movie. That was a sign of appreciation towards the quality of the movie. That they recognized the commercial value and commercial potential of the film and the concept, that they spent more money to dub it into English, and more money to film new scenes, and more money to re-edit it and rework it to make it something that could find larger success with American audiences. And it did that to such an extent that internationally, outside of Japan, Godzilla King of the Monsters, the 56 version, is essentially the official version as far as what was released to all of the various European markets and things like that first. And so successful to the point that Toho themselves, even in 1957, brought the King of the Monsters version back to Japan. So you had Japanese audiences seeing the subtitled English dub version, subtitled the English dub King of the Monsters, subtitled in Japanese in Japan, which I'm sure was an incredibly surreal experience. But the major changes are just the insertion of an American protagonist, a reporter named Steve Martin, played by Raymond Burr, who's there to sort of provide narration that moves the plot along at a quicker pace, and to provide, maybe not intentionally, but it is a American perspective on events. You know, there's the concept of arranged marriages is maybe considered a little foreign to US audiences of the 50s. So Raymond Burr's narration there sort of explains that bit of exposition to explain the love triangle between uh Sarazawa, Ogata, and Emiko, and just to kind of to move things through a little quicker. One of the big narrative changes that it starts off in the wreckage of Tokyo with Steve Martin half dead, and then and then the film, half of the film is a flashback to catch us up to that point. So it kind of that's a it's a kind of film noir narrative device of using narration and starting the story in the middle to kind of create suspense and intrigue and mystery that you then kind of spend the next 30 to 40 minutes catching up and unfolding exactly how it happens. So it's a lot of just sort of streamlining of the plot and the exposition to kind of move us along. They remove a lot of footage, add in the Raymond Burr footage, but to kind of literally, Raymond Burr's character is literally walking and observing with the American audience through the events of the film. He's not really terribly interactive with the characters in the plot, but he's sort of the stand-in, the entry point for the American viewers to sort of understand and sympathize and identify with this Japanese story, you know. And so it's a different narrative perspective. It's not a terribly different film, but it is a very different perspective.
Very well said, sir. I could not have said that any better. I absolutely would have been worse. Absolutely. They are two very different films, but I absolutely love them both. Like I said, I grew up on the 56, and once I finally was able to watch the uncut version, you know, the original 54, I put that on a much higher pedestal than the 56. But like you said, the nostalgia from watching 56 as a kid, you know, you love them both, and they're both good films in their own right.
Yeah, in terms of the measurements of the films, 54 I would call superior, and I would recommend it to anybody. But in terms of the significance, the importance of King of the Monsters to Godzilla being a globally recognized name, it can't be understated. And you know, there are some US cuts and alternate versions of movies that kind of feel like they destroy the soul of the Japanese version. Like this is especially if you talk about a film like Godzilla Raids Again, you know, Godzilla King of the Monsters is very respectful to what the original G54 is. It's just tailored a little bit to American tastes, but it doesn't feel like it just rips the heart and soul and punch out of it. You know, it maybe smooths some edges, but I have a lot of nostalgia for it just because I love the way that 50s era Hollywood, like the delivery of the dialogue and the writing of the dialogue, and so Raymond Burr's performance is just really interesting to see. It's like I said, that time capsule aspect of it. You can't appreciate, oh, Japanese language differences and Japanese dialogue differences as much because I don't speak Japanese. So I'm not seeing the difference of a 50s Japanese sort of dialogue and writing and performance versus 60s, 70s. It gets lost in translation, but I can appreciate the differences that Americans had in delivering and acting and writing in the 50s. So I like the 56 version for being able to appreciate that era of filmmaking a little bit more, but both are very good. 56 is sort of, people love 54 so much that the 56 version King of the Monsters gets sort of, I think it gets overly bashed. Like you have to really crap on it to talk about how much better the 54 version is to show how much you love 54. And 54 is better without a doubt, but it's like in the pantheon of Godzilla movies, King of the Monsters 56 is still like a really damn good movie and a really great launch to a franchise, and that's evident by how well it performed.
Yeah, for sure. And before we dive in a little too deep, We'll drop a trailer in here, get a plot synopsis for the film, and then we'll come back and get some numbers, some fun facts, and get into some characters and score and whatnot of the original 1954 Godzilla.
100万年前に生息した開きの大怪獣ゴジラ。水爆実験はついに太平洋に眠る大怪獣の怒りを買った。放射能を発し白熱の海溝を吐きながらゴジラは東京へ上陸した。
僕は反対です。
またわしは気まぐれに言ってるんではないよ。あのゴジラは世界中の学者が誰一人として見ていない日本だけに現れた貴重な研究知らず。
しかし先生、だからといってあの凶暴な怪物をあのままほっとくわけにはいきません。
君までがゴジラを抹殺しようというのか。
バカな、素人のあなた一人を海の中に放り込みますか。
俺が死なない限りどんなことで再び使用する立場に追い込まれないと誰が断言できる。
もしもそれが恐ろしい目的に使用されたとしたら。
青年科学者芹沢が秘めた恐るべき発明とは。
長年の研究の成果を何ということなさるんです。話せ。
近代兵器を装備し続々と出動する陸海空の精鋭。ゴジラの恐怖から脱出する難民の群れ。ただでさえうるさい国際問題が一体どうなるか。
尾形君頼むよ。はい。
制作費1億、6ヶ月の苦闘が生んだ世紀の巨編ゴジラ。映画技術の粋を集め大東宝が全能力を挙げた空前のスペクタクルゴジラ。本年最大の話題作ゴジラ。
When the Japanese freighter Iko Maru is destroyed near Odo Island, another ship, the Bingo Maru, is sent to investigate, only to meet the same fate with few survivors. A fishing boat from Odo is also destroyed with one survivor. Fishing catches mysteriously drop to zero and are blamed by an elder on the ancient sea creature known as Godzilla. Reporters arrive on Odo Island to further investigate. A villager tells one of the reporters that something in the sea is ruining the fishing. That evening, a storm strikes the island and destroys the reporter's helicopter, and Godzilla, briefly seen by one of the villagers, destroys 17 homes and kills 9 people and 20 of the villagers' livestock. Odo Island residents travel to Tokyo to demand disaster relief. The villagers and the reporters' evidence describe damage consistent with something large crushing the village. The government sends paleontologist Kiyohi Yamane to lead an investigation on the island, where giant radioactive footprints and a trilobite are discovered. The village alarm bell is rung and Yamane and the villagers rush to see the monster but retreat after they see that it is a giant dinosaur. Yamane presents his findings in Tokyo, estimating that Godzilla is 50 meters tall and evolved from an ancient sea creature becoming a terrestrial creature. He concludes that Godzilla has been disturbed by underwater hydrogen bomb testing. Debate ensues about notifying the public about the danger of the monster. Meanwhile, 17 ships are lost at sea. 10 frigates are dispatched to attempt to kill the monster using depth charges. The mission disappoints Yamane, who wants Godzilla to be studied. When Godzilla survives the attack, officials appeal to Yamane for ideas to kill the monster, but Yamane tells them that Godzilla is unkillable. He has survived H-bomb testing and must be studied. Yamani's daughter, Emiko, decides to break off her arranged engagement to Yamani's colleague, Daisuke Serizawa, because of her love for Hidede Ogata, a salvage ship captain. When a reporter arrives and asks to interview Serizawa, Emiko escorts the reporter to Serizawa's home. After Serizawa refuses to divulge his current work to the reporter, he agrees to give Emiko a demonstration on his recent project if she keeps it a secret. The demonstration horrifies her and she leaves without mentioning the engagement. Shortly after she returns home, Godzilla surfaces from Tokyo Bay and attacks Shinagawa. After attacking a passing train, Godzilla returns to the ocean. After consulting international experts, the JSDF construct a 30-meter high and 50,000-volt electrified fence along the coast using electrical pylons and deploy forces to stop and kill Godzilla. Dismayed that there is no plan to study Godzilla for its resistance to radiation, Yamani returns home, where Emiko and Ogata await and hope to get his consent for them to wed. When Ogata disagrees with Yamani and argues that the threat that the Godzilla poses outweighs any potential benefits from studying the monster, Yamani tells him to leave. Godzilla resurfaces and breaks through the fence to Tokyo with its atomic breath. The monster rampages through the city, killing thousands. The JSDF's efforts at a counterattack using tanks and F-86 Sabre fighter jets fail when Godzilla returns to Tokyo Bay. The next day, hospitals and shelters are crowded with the maimed and the dead, and some survivors suffer from radiation sickness. Distraught by the devastation, Emiko tells Ogata about Serizawa's research, a weapon called the Oxygen Destroyer, which disintegrates oxygen atoms and causes organisms to die of a rotting asphyxiation. Emiko and Ogata go to Serizawa to convince him to use the Oxygen Destroyer, but he initially refuses and explains that if he uses the device, the superpowers of the world will surely force him to construct more Oxygen Destroyers for use as a superweapon. After watching a program displaying the nation's current tragedy, Serizawa finally accepts their pleas. As Serizawa burns his notes, Emiko breaks down crying. A Navy ship takes Ogata and Serizawa to plant the device in Tokyo Bay after finding Godzilla. Serizawa unloads the device, cuts off his air support, and takes the secret of the Oxygen Destroyer to his grave. Godzilla is killed, but many mourn Serizawa's death. Yamani believes that if nuclear weapon testings continue, another Godzilla may awaken in the future.
Alright, I'll give you some numbers on the 54 Godzilla. This had a budget of 100 million yen, or roughly 175,000 American dollars. None of these numbers will be adjusted for inflation. Godzilla opened in Japan in 1954 and sold approximately 9.6 million tickets, which was the largest ticket amount sold until 1962's King Kong vs. Godzilla. This film is rated a 7.5 out of 10 on IMDb, a 93% on Rotten Tomatoes based on 75 reviews. 92% of Google users liked this film, and Godzilla is on screen for 8 minutes and 45 seconds, or roughly 9% of the film, with his first appearance coming at 22 minutes, or just about 23% into the film. So, I mean, for a 96-minute movie, you know, you get a little bit of Godzilla, but what we get him quite sparingly in this film for being, you know, almost 100 minutes long. But what we get of him in this film is just gold for the suitmation in my mind. We'll get into talking about different scenes and whatnot, I'm sure, but from his entrance to the city attacks to, you know, his demise underneath the ocean, I mean, what we get of Godzilla is pure gold in this film.
Yeah, it's all incredibly well done. You know, some fans obsess over this screen time notion, and like generally speaking, it feels like almost anytime you see the list about the screen time, it always feels like it hovers around somewhere between 8 to 12 minutes, or 8 to 15ish minutes. You know, like the average. I'd love to see what the average is, because I feel like it's somewhere in that sort of like 8 to 13 minutes kind of range. It's like, and that's kind of true for whether a Godzilla movie is 90 minutes or 100 minutes or 2 hours. It kind of just always feels like it's kind of in that realm. There's not that. There's not that movie doesn't exist where Godzilla is there for like half the screen time. Like that's just not real. Some of the third acts and final battles of some of the movies, you have Godzilla there constantly, but he's used incredibly well in this film. They build to it and build around it and work around it, and you have the characters constantly sort of the plot's always moving forward and the drama's always moving forward, and they've always got Godzilla being spoken about and discussed even when Godzilla is around. That's spoken of, that's mentioned a lot in a film like the 1931 Dracula, where Bela Lugosi's Dracula is not necessarily on screen for a terribly huge chunk of the film, but even when he's not on screen, you have a lot of the other characters talking about Dracula and keeping him in the conversation. So the overall presence is there, and I think when some people get to complaining about Godzilla films where they say he feels like he's barely in there, I think that's more of the case of the films feeling like Godzilla's presence totally exits, so that if the films get really wrapped up in completely other non-Godzilla things for extended periods of time, then you're like, well, what the heck? I thought this was a Godzilla movie. But I think when it sort of feels like the plot's moving forward and the drama's moving forward and Godzilla's staying on the minds of the characters, I think that works to make it still feel Godzilla focused even when Godzilla isn't on screen.
Yeah, I also feel like that if you get too much of him, you kind of lose your appreciation, because what kind of film you're watching. If you're watching a Godzilla film to see Godzilla, and if they spoil you with too much, he's on screen for 40 minutes out of a 100-minute movie, you're spoiled and you don't appreciate the time that you do get with him. But if he's on screen for 10 minutes out of that 100-minute film, you're waiting and the anticipation is building up. So finally, when you do get him, it's like a cheer inside your head, like, hell yeah, like finally he's here, now let's go.
Yeah, they're Godzilla movies. They're not movies about Godzilla. If that kind of, I don't know if that's kind of the most accurate way to put it. It's like you're never gonna have Godzilla have the most screen time of anybody in a Godzilla movie. Like, it's a giant monster movie. These are effects. Even in the suitmation days and the model days, like, these effects still required a lot of time and money and difficult technical execution to put on screen. So you can't just get infinite money and infinite time to put Godzilla on screen doing stuff for 20, 30, 40 minutes. It's almost financially impossible to do it.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like no matter what film you're watching, whether it be Godzilla or a horror franchise or Star Trek or anything, the film is always going to be character driven. When you have your main couple characters and they're going to be following the story, and in this one it just happens to be Dr. Serizawa and a couple others, and in the 56 version it's Steve Martin. So
yeah, exactly. And yes, Godzilla is a creature and a character, but you don't see a lot of people ranking the Friday the 13th movies based on the screen time that Jason gets, or the Halloween movies based on the screen time that Michael Myers gets, or the Star Wars movies based on how many lightsabers are on screen or how often the lightsaber battles happen. It just feels like, I understand where it's coming from, because people love Godzilla and they want more of him, and it's an easy criticism to say, like, oh, Godzilla's barely in this movie, what's going on here, it's a Godzilla movie, where is he? I understand that, but you kind of have to understand the other side of that too, that it's like, it's not just here for Godzilla to be standing on screen for an hour straight. Like, there's stories to tell. Godzilla is a character, but he's not a human character with human dynamics and drama. It can't be like, what's Godzilla's storyline and what's Godzilla's character arc. Most of these films are made in a way where that doesn't exist. So it's one of those fan debates that'll never go away, but it's just, we gotta the fandom in general, like, kind of has to frame their perspective on it a little differently.
Yeah, I have no problem with his screen time in any of the films. And if we do, I could complain about a couple, or somebody else could complain about a couple, but they're monster movies driven by human characters, and that's what everyone needs to understand.
Indeed.
All right, how about I get into a couple fun facts or behind the scene facts for you? I got a couple on the 54 film.
Let's do it.
Godzilla symbolizes nuclear holocaust and has been identified as a strong metaphor from this film for nuclear weapons, which anybody that knows this franchise knows that.
Absolutely. The atomic testing in the Bikini Atoll is that led to the unfortunate situation of the crew members of the Lucky Dragon number 5. They went out fishing in the area that was deemed a no fish zone while they conducted this test. They didn't tell the Japanese public why all of the fishing folks had to not be in the area, and so they were conducting the H bomb test. So the crew was, poisoned for, got the radiation sickness, radiation poison, however it's termed, and they all ended up dying, and it was a big thing for Japan because Japan was the only country we dropped atom bombs on, and then now the first victims of the H bomb testing were now Japanese sailors or Japanese fishermen, and so it's a very sort of like hitting close to home kind of concept. There's a reason that the first thing that we see destroyed in the movie is a fishing boat, and so that was intentional. So it's a very fictional and very entertaining adventure blockbuster kind of story, but it's got these very genuine, real, earnest nuggets at the center of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Very well said. Close-up shots of Godzilla in this film were accomplished using puppets of Godzilla's upper body rather than the full body suit, and in addition, a partial Godzilla suit consisting only of the monster's lower body was employed for some of the shots of Godzilla's legs or like him walking across the train tracks.
Yeah, the initial suit they made was so heavy it was essentially impossible to move in. So they cut it in half and they used the bottom half for a lot of shots of the feet and the legs. And I know they did make a full body suit because you see full body shots in the film, but I don't know if the top half was kept to just top half shots. I think they had the full body suit and then they used the bottom half suits almost like sort of like with overall straps, but they would use that for just shots of the legs and the feet and things like that. And then they have it's pretty obvious when they cut to the close-ups of the puppet when the puppet is in use. It's not exactly a 1-for-1 match with the suit. There are other films later that do it a little better and things like that. But but you do see the puppet, but the puppet has this kind of cool articulation and movement to it because it's literally a hand puppet. So it's got this interesting kind of look to it in general to the movement. But it's an interesting effect.
Yeah, I mean, if you look up the 54 Godzilla on like Wiki or Google or anything, you can see, the half suit where the guy's just wearing like Godzilla's legs and his upper body is clearly out of the suit. He's got like almost like the overalls with the suit. And, I mean, you can look all that stuff up, and it's interesting to see how they did the suitmation and like how all these suits became. I mean, it's insane to me because I am nowhere near that talented.
Yeah, and it's a lost art almost in a lot of ways.
Yep, CGI, it's taken over, or it has taken over, I should say.
Indeed.
The sound effects team originally tried to create Godzilla's roar by using animal roars that had been edited. They sampled all kinds of birds and mammals, but nothing seemed to be like the right match for the reptile-like noises the monster like Godzilla would have made. Akira Ifukube, who was the film's composer, proposed stepping away from using animal samples, and he took a string off of a contrabass and rubbed it with gloves soaked in pine tar, and that is the sound that became as Godzilla's roar in this film, which I mean, if you listen to it closely, you can definitely tell it's some sort of instrument, and it's a phenomenal roar. I mean, of all the Godzilla roars in the franchise, I mean, this is probably in every fan's mind a top 10 or a top 5 rendition of it.
Yeah, I first want to point out that whenever I would come across this piece of trivia, it always says that the glove was soaked in resin. And I remember always being like, what is what specific resin? Like, what was the material? Like, what was this resin made of? What was it? Like everyone's just like, oh, it was in resin. It was in resin. It's like, is there an official formula for what resin is? I'm like, I thought resin could be many different things. I was always like bugging, like trying to figure out like what, and the fact that you've said it was pine tar, it's like, thank you. Like, I was always like curious, like exactly what was this glove dipped in that was then run along this string. So I'm glad to finally have that piece of trivia solved for myself. And I do love that, when you do hear the original roar, it does have a sort of it's got a kind of musical quality to it, like a musical instrumental kind of like, it feels like almost like a note being played or something to that effect. And I love that Akira Ifukube, the original composer of the film, is also the father of Godzilla's original roar. Like how amazing is that he's not just responsible for these iconic musics, but is responsible for the iconic sound of Godzilla. Like that's an amazing and beautiful thing to me.
Yeah, I mean, a sound that became synonymous. I mean, if you play a Godzilla roar off of YouTube or your phone as like a ringtone or something, like people know what it is. I mean, it's one of the most recognizable sounds probably in film.
100%. There's a couple of different versions that might be more iconic than others, but people know the Godzilla roar.
Yeah, just like the Godzilla theme, we'll get into that, or the Jaws theme, or Halloween. People know those sounds from film.
Exactly.
Originally, the effects in the film were supposed to be accomplished by stop motion animation, which was popular at the time. But due to the film's budget, Eiji Tsuburaya made up a newer and cheaper method for this film, which was later dubbed the Suitmation, which was foam fabricating costumes that are coated with layers of latex and portrayed with actors inside.
Yeah, there's a famous anecdote where apparently Tsuburaya was, making the proposal for stop motion animation because Tsuburaya was a huge fan of the original King Kong and kind of on his own had like reversed engineered how a lot of the effects in King Kong were done. And so he wanted to do it stop motion, and they kind of asked him to work out like, well, how long would the effects take if you were to do it all in stop motion, like in terms of time and just like the time required. And he came up with like, he was like, oh, 7 years. And they're like, all right, well, what else you got? We can't do that. So they had to come up with other methods, and the Suitmation was the solution.
And I think it's phenomenal. I love it. I love the Suitmation and I love the miniatures. But despite them not being able to use the stop motion, there are two shots in the film that are stop motion, which one is at roughly 58.5 minutes with what looks like a toy fire truck sent to stop the fire caused by Godzilla's rampage flips over. And then at about an hour and 4 minutes into the film, Godzilla swings his tail into a nearby building and destroys it. And those two scenes were finished with stop motion or created with stop motion.
Yeah. Yeah, the tail shot always stuck out. When you're a kid, I think you always call it like claymation or that's clay or something, because it just kind of has that look. And the fire truck one is interesting because it always looked visually kind of odd. I never knew specifically that it was a stop motion thing. I always kind of wondered, I'm like, is this some kind of weird like, frame rate thing with the camera? When you over crank the camera, it shoots at faster than 24 frames a second. When you under crank the camera, it shoots at more than or no or yeah, when you over crank it, it shoots at faster frames per second than 24. So when it's played at 24, it creates slow motion. When you under crank the camera, it shoots at fewer than 24 frames a second. So then when that's played at 24, it looks faster. So I always assumed it was one of those kind of tricks. But hearing that it was stop motion isn't that shocking, to be honest.
No, it at the time I'm sure it didn't look too bad, but that the fire truck scene has not aged very well.
Not terribly.
There is some stock footage of Godzilla's rampage from this film that would later be used in the monster Varan's attack on Tokyo in the 1958 film Varan.
Interesting. Varan is one of the Toho, one of the sort of classic vintage Toho monster films that I have not watched.
I am right there with you. I have not seen that. It is on the list to get to eventually.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of issues with the status of its restoration or the status of its American version, and I I'm not an expert on that one, but I know there's a lot of like odd things when it comes to Varan. So it would be interesting to see if that ever gets some kind of proper restoration and proper American release or anything like that. It feels like it's kind of been lost to the ether. Like even attempts to bring Varan back as a creature feel very, like they just never seem to come to fruition.
Yeah, I mean it probably just wasn't as big a hit as they hoped. So like you said, it's kind of just lost to the time.
Hmm.
All right, I got one more fun fact for you, or behind the scenes fact, and that is the film Godzilla spawned a multimedia franchise that was recognized by Guinness World Records as the longest running film franchise in film history. And the character Godzilla has since become an international popular culture icon. The film and Tsuburaya, they've both been largely credited for establishing the template for tokusatsu media, and the film received reappraisal in later years and has since been regarded as one of the best monster films ever made.
Yeah, most American audiences hadn't seen any version of the original 54 cut until I think 2004 when they did some screenings for the 50th anniversary showing the original subtitled version. I think up to that point officially in America there had never been any kind of official release of that. It was only always King of the Monsters, and then, you know, after the 50th anniversary and in the age of DVD and Blu-ray and stuff, the originals kind of gotten to have its day, so its legacy sort of been restored and brought back up. And the interesting thing about that Guinness record, again, I'm not going to presume to know exactly what Guinness's criteria are, but they do make a point to call it the longest continuously running film franchise because people have pointed out that I think there's a Chinese franchise with many more movies, and I think there are other film franchises arguably that have started sooner and still continue. Technically, something like King Kong. So I don't know specifically what their criteria is, but longest continuously running film franchise is what it has. It has almost 40 entries, but it's also never taken a full 10 years off between films. So I don't know if there's a certain hiatus mark that has to be met. I don't know if there's a certain this, that, or the other, but it is recognized by Guinness as the longest continuously running film franchise. There's never been more than 9 years and change between any two movies, and it's coming up on film number 38.
Yeah, and hopefully many more to come. Hopefully with Godzilla minus one doing so well, maybe they've already started talks of a sequel for that, and then with Godzilla and Kong, the New Empire, hopefully that does super well with like some younger fans and whatnot. But I feel like Godzilla, he might have another hiatus or a gap and a break coming up here soon, but he's never gonna go away. There's always franchises always die for a little bit. Halloween, Friday the 13th, Dracula, Godzilla, King Kong, but there's always interest down the road for some a sequel to be made or a requel, a prequel, whatever. There's always some interest in those franchises.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see another sort of 9-10 year hiatus again. I think those days are done. I think even if minus one had been a horrible flop, and even if Godzilla and Kong the New Empire is a horrible flop, I think at most that's like 5 years later you're going to get a new movie. Or here's the thing, Godzilla minus one is a massive hit, so even if Godzilla Kong flops, they'll probably make some kind of sequel or follow up to Godzilla minus one. That might just be the end of what Hollywood's doing with Godzilla. It's just the property and the IP is just, in this day and age, things aren't allowed to rest and die for 10 years. They're going to be brought back within about 5.
Yeah, and it's great that Hollywood and Toho both have a hold on it. So, one way or another, I feel like you said, we're going to get a film.
Exactly. And they're bouncing back and so far seem to be finding a lot of success, each of them doing their own thing. So we're not only having a Godzilla franchise continuing in the modern era, we're having the Godzilla franchise on two different sort of iterations of the Godzilla franchise continued in the modern era, which is fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely love where it seems to be going here in the modern day. All right, how about we go back to 54 and I ask you who your favorite character was for this film?
Sure. My favorite character was Professor Yamane. I like his character because he's sort of he's kind of in the middle a little bit. You could call him maybe a fence sitter, but he's sort of this you have the characters that want Godzilla dead because he's a threat and he could kill people, and Yamane sees that and recognizes that, and he's not blind to that fact, but he sort of respects Godzilla as a unique scientific anomaly. He, for other reasons, he even says bluntly, he's like, Godzilla survived the effects of the atomic bomb. Like, don't you think we should learn something about that? Clearly showing fears that's like, if there's a key to like resistance to radiation within Godzilla, like that could be very valuable in a world that's very concerned about nuclear warfare. So he's got these scientific concerns and interests, but he's clearly torn and struggling with the fact that Godzilla is a danger and menace to the people of Japan. So I like his character sort of conflict.
Yeah, great character. I mean, I loved everything about him in this film. He's someone you can care about and easily get on his side in this film. For my favorite character, I went a little bit different way. I chose Dr. Sarazawa just because he's quiet, all he cares about is work. He's got like his love life that I feel like he knows kind of isn't going in his favor. It's kind of going down the drain. She cares for someone else, and he wants to be left alone with his work. He's kind of almost in a way like a recluse. He just again wants to be left alone, wants to do his work, and he cares about mankind. He cares about people, and he's someone that I easily liked in the film, I guess you could say. I easily connected with because I'm one of those people that, I kind of want to be left alone. I want to go to work. I want to come home to my family. I mean, in this film, he doesn't have a family really, but I want to come home to my family and continue my day. I don't want to have a bunch of people in my face and whatnot, so it was easy for me to connect to him because he just wants to do his job and be left alone.
Yeah,
But also a great character, I like Sarazawa.
yeah, he's an excellent sort of tragic heroic character in the story, and certainly to make a little bit of levity here, like you know a a character who is perceived as a bit of a genius, who's very reclusive, who who has a girl that he loves, who doesn't love him back, and he doesn't get the girl at the end. Like, I think there's a lot of modern men that could maybe identify with that struggle. Like they're reclusive, they're kind of smart and into their own interests and hobbies, and like they've got the girl that they want, but that girl doesn't want them. I don't think that's terribly hard to relate to for many men in the modern era.
Yeah, I mean, we got two great characters here, and easily both of them could be related to. I mean, I could relate to Dr. Yamani because I'm an animal lover. I would love to be studying animals or something like that. And then Sarazawa, like you said, he wants to come home, do his work, and be left alone with his lady or his family and whatever. And he doesn't get that. He doesn't, like you said, it's kind of like a tragic love story for him.
Indeed.
I'll go ahead and give you my favorite score for the film, which, I mean, I did. It's very easy to choose the main Godzilla march. So I did not choose that one for this film, even though it's probably my favorite out of the soundtrack. I tried to go with a different one, which was called Godzilla Comes Ashore. I like that track. It's just dark, and with the scene of Godzilla coming ashore and getting into the power lines and attacking them, and just the gritty roar of that scene mixed with that soundtrack. I absolutely love it. It almost kind of gives me chills every time, just how like dark it is and how like gritty as roar is and deep the actual music is. We all know that main Godzilla march is always going to be the best. So I tried to go a little different route with the score in this film.
Yeah, I that's a good piece. It's got a lot of dread and kind of suspense building to it. I unapologetically did go with the main title. Uh, and part of the reason that I went with it is there's a lot of with a lot of long running franchises there's hallmarks of the franchises that everyone knows. You know, you think of Jason, you think of the hockey mask, but then when you dive into Friday the 13th, Jason isn't even the killer in the first Friday the 13th movie, and Jason doesn't even wear the hockey mask until the third movie. You know, it's like this evolution of this process to get to the sort of icon. And with Godzilla, some of the most iconic aspects of the character are that main Godzilla march as well as the roar. And with this film, you go back to the original Godzilla movie, and maybe you think if you're a newcomer, like when are some of the iconic and famous aspects of Godzilla going to come into play? And the very first scene of this movie, the opening titles, you hear the Godzilla roar and then get the main Godzilla piece of music. Like they've literally been there. The roar and the music were there before any character, before any shot was on screen, before anything else but the title. That roar and that music was there, and I think that's incredibly sort of like iconic and potent and amazing. And so like it's just that it has to be my favorite music for this because it's arguably the most important piece of music in the whole franchise. So I have to go with it here.
Yeah, and I absolutely love it. The Godzilla, the main Godzilla march is my ringtone on my cell phone. And I mean, if you're not my dad or my lady, they have specific ringtones, but if you're not one of those couple people, I mean, you're getting the Godzilla march as your ringtone. And the original soundtrack from the 54 version sounds like this. I'll play a little just so we can appreciate this. Most film fans, again, just like Godzilla's roar, they can identify that soundtrack and be like, oh, that's Godzilla. That's almost common sense. Like we've said before, like the Jaws theme or the Halloween theme, that people just know that sound.
Indeed. And as much as I can respect any of the American movies for trying to go in their own direction with Godzilla's music, and some of it is better than others, I'll always be an advocate for Godzilla needs his main theme just in the same way that like James Bond needs his music or Star Wars needs its music, like it's fine to try and do something different. And some of the Japanese movies have gone without using the main Godzilla theme, but I think that's kind of almost one of those arguments that you kind of can't win. Akira Ifukube is, I think, along with someone like a John Williams, is like one of the all-time great composers. It's like you're not just going to come in and one shot a theme that's more epic and iconic and amazing and valuable in film history than what Ifukube did with the 54 film.
Yeah, if a Godzilla film doesn't have that in there, I'll appreciate the soundtrack for what it is. But all I'm asking, is give it to us once. Give that Godzilla march with him entering the city or the island or the fighting scenes, him coming up to the other monsters. Give us that Godzilla march anytime that you can, at least once in a film.
Indeed.
All right, Chris, how about your favorite quote or most memorable line for this 54 original Godzilla?
Um, from the American version, I like the line. They're actually both the lines come from the same scene, but in the American version, Ogata has a great line where he's talking to Serizawa, who's struggling with the decision. Well, here I'll flip the order since I'll put the lines in the order. So in the Japanese version, Serizawa says something to the effect of he's worried about what they'll do with his invention of the oxygen destroyer if he uses it. And he says, A bombs versus A bombs, H bombs versus H bombs. He's pondering the devastation of what another arms race could happen and how the oxygen destroyer could play into that. And then in the American cut of the film, later on in that scene, Ogata has a line to him where he says, you have uh you have to face what no other man can face, which is you have Godzilla, you have your fears, which might become reality, and you have Godzilla, which is reality. And those are just like that scene where they're debating the usage of the oxygen destroyer and trying to convince Serizawa to use it is sort of like the core struggle of the film. And so, in both cuts of the movie, there's some really interesting and dynamic lines of dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. And me and you were pretty much on the same path for quote for the 54 original. And that was when Serizawa says, Ogata, if the oxygen destroyer is used even once, the politicians of the world won't stand idly by. They'll inevitably turn it into a weapon. A bombs against A bombs, H bombs against H bombs. As a scientist, no. As a human being, adding a terrifying weapon to humanity's arsenal is something I can't allow.
Yeah, which is great, and it sort of pulls, he's it's other people have mentioned that it's kind of pulling from the way that Oppenheimer kind of struggled with the fact that he was the father of the atomic bomb and things like that, and it's like he made this great and terrible invention that was capable of so much destruction, but so it it's just a lot of layers to add to the character. It's just a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I know. In a lot of these films, you won't find, a lot of hard hitting quotes or some, as we get later on down the line, you'll get some funny lines here and there, but not a lot of quotes that are talking about, he can't release this because it could destroy humanity, or it could be used as a weapon to destroy foreign countries and whatnot. So, I mean, there's a couple hard hitting lines in this film that makes you realize that this film, and it makes you appreciate how seriously it was taken for what we grew up of thinking that it was just a monster movie.
Yeah, and they have plenty of value as monster movies, but some of them reach a little higher and deeper and do some much more interesting things. In future films we get Shakespearean lines like Godzilla, what terrible language.
Hey, that's bound to be somebody's favorite.
Yeah, I mean it's certainly iconic in its own right.
All right, how about I'll actually go first on this one. I'll give you my favorite scene since you did quote.
Sure.
And my favorite scene for this film, I mean, we might not be in the same ballpark on this one, and we might be. I feel like I know what your favorite scene is gonna be.
Okay.
Mine was Godzilla, or when Godzilla's attacking Tokyo, and they come to realize that there's nothing they can do to stop this beast. They're throwing the tanks at him. They try to wrap the power lines, around the city, and he gets through them, and there's just nothing. And with the city engulfed in flames, and the score kicking in from Ifukube, and it's almost like a beautiful scene with like how hard, if you think about it, it was to make these miniatures and have the suitmation, a guy running around in a suit destroying all these miniatures with the flames and fire in the background and whatnot. I just it's it's the hardest hitting scene because, you know, you see death during the scene. The family, the mother and the children, you know, she's telling them that, you know, don't worry, we're going to be with daddy soon, because she knows her and her kids are going to die because Godzilla's attacking the city. And it's just a hard hitting scene, even, you know, in for being, again, a monster movie. You know, it hits you right in the feels.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't go wrong picking any of the destruction and the action scenes in the film. It's all incredibly well executed. If I had to pick a favorite scene, I think I would go with Godzilla's first reveal on the island. Just because the build up to it, you know, the hitting the bell and the villagers all scrambling and running, and Godzilla just peering up over the top of the hill, the top of the mountain, and it's just sort of it's just always one of those. It's like, even as a little kid, when I would watch this movie and kind of like joke about it being old and black and white and stuff, that scene just kind of sticks in your brain a little bit. It's just kind of like an iconic shot. And so and then you see, you know, you hear it leaving, and then you see the footprints from the overhead view of it going into the water. I just like seeing the aftermath of it was always just fascinating to me. So that's probably my favorite scene.
And that's honestly what I thought you were going to say, because that
Yeah.
was my number two, you know,
Yeah.
seeing him raise up over that mountainside or the hill and just giving that grand roar.
Yeah,
It's
and
an
it
amazing scene.
and it's in broad daylight too, you know, a lesson that could be learned for many monster movies that like to hide the monsters at night. You know, a broad daylight reveal of Godzilla was in the original film.
Yeah, and it's honestly, you know, we've had so many different reveals of Godzilla in, you know, in each film. There's a grand reveal of him, or in most of the films, and this is up there as easily one of the best. You know, it's the first time we get to see him, and it's a sight to see, even in black and white from 70 years ago.
Absolutely.
Well, I know you wanted to get into like a tier ranking or a franchise ranking. We're going to split the Godzilla films into eras. So we'll do the Showa era. Clearly, this is the only film we've done so far. So clearly, this stands as number one at the top until we continue on with the franchise. But what did you think of Godzilla's design in this? We'll get into some monster design.
Yeah. It's kind of the iconic look. It's sort of lays the groundwork for all of them to follow. There's not a lot to compare and contrast it to up to this point, but it's an excellent creature design. And you know, one of the details about this design, you know, the sort of fangs and teeth are a little longer. It's got a little bit more of this animalistic side to it. I like that this Godzilla design has ears. It sort of makes it feel a bit more dragon like, in the way that you'd often see like dragons in certain fiction have like ears. You know, I think that adds just a little hint to its silhouette. You know, the ears that way sort of helps differentiate it from just looking like a giant lizard or crocodile or what have you. So like I like that this one kind of has ears, and it's just like it's a solid like tank of a design. It's thick, it's sturdy, it just is very imposing. I'm a big fan of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with everything you said. You know, this is the original design, and it's easily in the franchise a top tier. You know, if some people rank them, you know, they put it in S tier. You know, and I would definitely agree with that,
Yeah,
because I mean, for being 70 years old and using the suit mation and having to design this to fit, or to find an actor to fit that's willing to do the suit mation and wear it and destroy the miniatures and whatnot. This is a great design from top to bottom. Like you said, the ears, you know, it looks a little funny in some shots, which we talked about earlier, that you can tell is the puppet. But other than that, for a starting film, this is a phenomenal Godzilla design. And I mean, I don't truly think we have very many that are better than this, if any at all.
Indeed. And every self-respecting Godzilla fan knows that if you do a tier ranking, the top tier isn't S tier, it's G tier.
Okay, you got me on that one. All right.
I can't help it. I can't help it. I see whenever I see the tier rankings, every fandom always has like their own weird thing for S tier. Like so. Like for me, I'm like, well, the top one for Godzilla would have to be G tier, right? So this is a G tier suit.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a G tier suit in a G tier film, then we should say.
Exactly. 100%. 100%.
All right. Let's get into some final thoughts of the film. I mean, for coming out nearly 70 years ago, this is a top monster film for me. I watch this every year. I mean, a couple times a year, I'll throw this on and I'll sit down and watch it, along with all the other Godzilla films. It's a it's a classic in every way possible, and I I'm glad I finally got to watch the original Japanese 54, because I was not high on, as I got older and grew up, I wasn't very high on the 56 King of the Monsters film at all, besides nostalgia. And seeing this original 54 film, I absolutely loved it. And I don't mind reading the subtitles. I don't mind it being in another language. I love it. This is a classic film for me, probably a top 10 Godzilla film all time. I mean, I know if people don't say that, it's blasphemy, but there are fans out there that, don't like it because of the black and white, or it just being an older film and not much going on in the film besides the couple Godzilla rampages. So they like a more modern film. But anybody who's a Godzilla fan knows this is a classic, and it's a G tier Godzilla film. Nailed it.
Absolutely. I'd probably say, I don't know if I'd say it automatically must be in your top 3, especially as more and more great films get added. I don't know how you keep it out of the top 5, maybe, for me personally, but I mean, it's kind of always got to be up very high, both out of obligation to its significance, but also because the 54 cut is just a legitimately, really well made movie. It's a classic. The 56 American version is sort of a great 50s monster movie. It's sort of cut into more of that mold that if you watch other 50s monster movies before and after, are kind of like, it feels more of that style, while the 54 Japanese cut is a bit more doing its own thing, a bit more of just kind of a film unto itself, and kind of apart from that. And then you have kind of all of the Hollywood versions of how monster movies are done that the 56 movie kind of feels a bit more of a piece of. I love both cuts of the movie for different reasons. I think Raymond Burr's performance is really interesting and unique, and sure, some of the editing techniques and the filming new actors and cutting it in, you know, some of that stuff hasn't aged terribly well, so it feels like, the American edit feels a little clunky in some spots when he's talking to stand-ins and body doubles and things like that. And even the film stock between the American version of the movie and the Japanese footage doesn't really match in terms of like the grain and things. But it's still like a really solid 50s monster movie, really good kind of classic. But the 54 is like, it's one of it's an all-time great film. It's within the genre, within Japanese and American film history, within franchise film history, special effects film history. It's a benchmark in a lot of ways. So, hats off to it.
Yeah, there's a reason it's been regarded as one of the best monster films ever made. So I'm from what I'm hearing from both of us. I mean, granted, clearly we're Godzilla fans, but this is an absolute recommend from both of us. If you haven't seen it, I mean, get out there and give this a chance. It is in black and white. It's in another language, but give it a chance. And I mean, if you don't like it, to each their own, but we're pretty sure you're going to like it. And all the Godzilla fans out there, they know why we're talking about this film, and they know how significant it is, and that they know that it's a classic as well. So it's absolutely a recommend.
Yeah, 100%. If you're a newer fan coming in, it's tough to say, oh, well, you must go back and watch every single movie, but it's never hard to recommend that you at least go back and see franchise. You know, you don't necessarily have to jump into watching every single movie right away in the order that they came out, but if you've seen a couple of the modern stuff, you've been exposed to a little of the modern stuff, and you just kind of want that flashpoint of where it all came from, going back and watching the original 54 is a great idea. You know, if you're kind of a student of film and you want to see the ways that films can be sort of re-edited and reworked, and the way that a film can kind of be transformed with not really that many changes or that crazy of a reworking of the whole thing, you can compare and contrast the 54 and 56 and kind of see how kind of dramatically different but still similar they are to one another. And it's an interesting lesson in film editing and reinterpretation and things of that nature. And so, you know, there's a lot of value here in this original movie and in the American, you know, counterpart.
Yeah, absolutely. Both films are great in their own right, but I mean, if you want to get the true experience, give that 1954 original a chance. And
100%.
I just feel like you won't be sorry. I
100
mean, you know,
100%.
it might not be your cup of tea, but it's worth the watch, even if, you know, want to give it a once over. I mean, it absolutely worth it.
Definitely.
So Godzilla was followed by a direct sequel on April 24th, 1955, titled Godzilla Raids Again, or in the American title, it was Gigantus the Fire Monster. And Chris and I will be looking at that on our next episode. So Chris, thanks for joining me on this. You know, we start the journey to what is so far 38 Godzilla films, and it's going to be a fun one. So I appreciate you joining me and nerding out together on these.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be a wild ride, and I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. So again, we got Godzilla Raids Again next week, but until next time.